stories of trying to get that across. And I know we'll probably flesh these out in more detail as we go through this. But one thing is just in terms of basic principles that from that perspective, the idea is it's unjust to violate someone's property rights or to initiate aggression. That's the standard definition of libertarianism, at least in the American tradition, in the wake of Murray Rothbard. And so if that's your principle, that you can't initiate aggression against somebody else, well, then the state by its very nature does that, right? It's not that the state empirically a lot of times happens to do that. It's just, no, by its very nature, if it were a voluntary institution, to put it differently, it wouldn't qualify as a state. And so the two specific attributes of the state that I have in mind are the fact that it engages in taxation and that it claims, at least within a certain territory, a monopoly on the determination of the legitimate use of violence. All right, so it's not that the state says we're the only ones who can use violence, but they say, the people running it, we can determine when a use of violence is justified or not. So like they could say if someone's breaking into your house, you're allowed to shoot them if they want. So it's not that they're saying only police officers can ever shoot somebody, but the state is saying it's up to us to determine whether you are allowed to do that or not. And if we want to, we can say, no, the rule is you can't do that, like in the areas that are so-called gun-free zones. And taxation, again, that's qualitatively different from any other kind of payment for a service. That what it means to say you're being taxed for something, as opposed to the state provides some, like a bridge, and if they charge a toll, that's not really a tax because you don't have to use the bridge or not. But the state doesn't say, hey, anybody who wants to use our military services, here's how much we're going to bill you each month. It's saying, no, we are going to provide these services and we're charging you, and if you don't like it, we'll put you in a cage ultimately. Okay, so that's the sense. So that's, one umbrella is just to say you can't support such an institution if you have a certain ethical framework. And then the other element is just a pragmatic listing and just an analysis of the various things that the state does, and to show that not only, like, any legitimate thing a state does could be handled through voluntary means. And so, and on top of that, it's that in practice, when the state tries to accomplish something, even if it's inherently okay, like education or building roads, things like that aren't intrinsically evil, that still the state does a worse job of it for standard economic reasons that free market economists can go through.
So I've got a whole list of all the whatabouts, all the objections that always come up. The biggest one I think that people have the most trouble with is, that you kind of alluded to, is protection from crime. And also, I'll lump the two together, even though they're a little bit separate, and national defense. How do you, let's say you've got this anarcho-capitalist society going, how do you prevent, not everybody else is anarcho-capitalist, so they've got these aggressive militaries going. How do you prevent one of those militaries from coming in and taking over and occupying? And then domestically, how do people protect themselves against crime?
Okay, sure. And this is, I know you're going to be linking to things, but this was the essence of my booklet, Chaos Theory, which was 2 essays. One was private law and one was private defense, for people to just know that what I'm going to be saying now is, that's where I laid a lot of this stuff out. So the private defense, like for military invasion, I think that's actually conceptually easier to walk through. And so maybe we'll start with that one. So again, the logic here is, just like you could hear people who are libertarians, again, in the American political context, with a small L at least, might argue against, we don't need political support of schools. You don't need taxpayer funding of schools. You could just have it be done voluntarily. The quality will be better. There's more competition. And then, in cases if there's poor kids who either they're orphans or their parents really can't afford to send them to school, there'll be philanthropic organization. The community's not going to sit there and let some kids grow up and not know how to read. That's crazy. They'll support them, and you don't need effectively the government to stick a gun at everyone's head and say, you better contribute to this thing that we all agree is worthwhile, right? That you don't need to force the community to do something that just 99.9% agree. Yeah, of course we would do that in a civilized world. Okay, so that's kind of the logic. And so, but where even a lot of people who favor privatization of services they think that, okay, yeah, that works for things like schools and mail delivery and even building roads. Maybe people might have some trouble about, well, gee, who would determine the right of way and the traffic lights and what. But the idea that you don't need political officials in charge of hiring guys to lay concrete and stuff, most people get that. But when it comes to what if there's foreign nations that are amassing armies and they're going to invade us, surely just to let the free market fend that off seems kind of crazy. How would that work? So that's what we'll tackle here. So I think the first thing for like, and what I have in mind is like a major city, like a New York or an LA, something like that. And then what if it were anarcho-capitalist? How would it defend itself against invasion? So I think one thing is you'd start with insurance contracts. And so just like the owners of the skyscrapers would have fire insurance policies, like, hey, what if there's a big 4-alarm blaze or something? What do you do? Well, of course, there'd be insurance to say if the property is damaged from fire, then the insurance company compensates the owners. And then it would be in the interest of the insurance companies to say, okay, for a huge building where, potentially we might owe billions in compensation, one thing that we'll do is we'll have clauses and say, here's what your premium would be if you don't have any standard common sense things that would prevent fire. But it would be astronomical, the premiums, because the potential liability is so high. And if it's a building that's made up out of lumber and gasoline that's sprinkled all over the place, people are smoking, they would say, yeah, if you want us to insure that for fire, we're going to charge you a huge premium. And so instead they'd say, however, if you build according to these codes and you have a sprinkler system and you have contractual arrangement with the local voluntary, private sector fire departments and blah, 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 and you go through all these things that would, prevent a fire from occurring and then quickly suppress it in case it start, up to the latest cutting edge standards in the industry, then we can afford to charge you a much lower premium for this coverage, because we as the insurance company know, okay, now the chance of there being $1 billion claim from this building is a lot lower, because look at all these procedures. And we would have the right to like send in inspectors and check your sprinklers. Spot checks. We're not going to announce it. We're just going to show up, and have you walk us through, and we'll see what the fire extinguishers are located and they're full, all that kind of stuff. And the smoke alarms are working. So, that's kind of the model. So that's the idea. And I think most people can follow what I said there. And so I just notice, I'm saying that's why you don't need the mayor's office to come up with building codes and to have a, fire, like that stuff's all voluntary. Like, and in fact, you would expect that to be better in the long run than if it was a political process determining those fire codes and things. Because it's, the politicians, it's not their money on the line. Whereas you'd expect the insurance company to really be on top of the latest innovations and studying, the experience of their competitors in other cities and things. Okay, so then just take it one step further. Another possible bad thing that could happen to your skyscraper is a foreign army might, send its air force over and drop bombs on it. And so maybe you'd want to have insurance against that kind of contingency. And so it'd be a similar process. And again, you're paying premiums, but now here, the insurance company is going to have to, when they're going to cover you and say, how much would we charge in a premium? They would have to say, well, what's the chance that this event is going to happen? And it's a lot lower if we have, surface-to-air missile sites set up, and if we have our own air force and whatever that can repel invasion, and we have radar stations and blah blah blah, and we have intelligence networks that scour the globe to give us early warning about, these people over here are massing troops, and their politicians are saying that we're sitting on their historical land, and they're trying to get their people ginned up to be okay with them conquering us, and blah blah blah. That that's the kind of information that so it'd be in the insurance in this model, and this is just one idea. I think it would play out like this, but again, if it's a free society, they might come up with a better idea, but this could work. So it would be, when you say like, well, who would fund national defense or city defense in this example, if it's just a big giant city, it would be the insurance companies would be the direct payers. And so the system is like the broad property owners would be paying premiums to their insurance companies, defending or compensating them in the possibility of a invasion or military damage, whatever.
So
and then just it would be the companies hiring it. Yep.
So you might be about to go onto this tangent, but I think a question that'll come up for people is, well, then what's to prevent those insurance companies or whoever it is that's setting up the surface-to-air missiles and all that, what's to prevent them from becoming an aggressive imperialist type military?
Okay, yeah, great question. So here, and this is going to bleed into, the other big thing about private law. How could that work? So if you just, for the moment, and again, we'll come back to this and explore it, but if we just stipulate for the sake of argument that there is a law, there's law and order, there's the rule of law in this society right now, and then we're just saying if that could be possible, suspend your disbelief for the moment. How could these people, these free people, defend themselves from a foreign invasion? That's what we're answering right now. So the answer is, like, all these insurance companies. So for one thing, they would not be themselves maintaining the SAM sites and the tanks and troops and snipers and blah blah blah. I think they would just be buying those services, right? So I think there'd be competition. So it wouldn't be one company that would own all of the military hardware. There would be competition, just like in any private industry right now that's not propped up by government regulations. There's even in industries where there's like one giant player, there's typically one competitor, right? That kind of keeps them honest, and that phrase is metaphorical, but
or
also
at least the threat of competition. At least they know that they can't go too crazy, or someone will come in and.
Right. And so that's that's what happens. So there still would be the rule of law. Again, there's not taxing them. They're not allowed to take money from anybody, and so that that's the quick answer. And even, by the way, just to show what I mean, so right now it's standard, like if if troops are invading your country, you might do things like blow up the bridges and do things to try to like slow their advance. So in the kind of world I'm talking about in the framework, even if certain, let me say one thing just so people finish the train of thought. So how would the insurance company figure out how to price these services, like to know what they're worth? Again, it would just go back to, they might say, okay, so we have policies that we've provided coverage in all these major skyscrapers in this region, or some of them at least, and maybe there's competitors that have done other ones, and maybe we'll pay bounties so that our actuaries run the numbers, and we say, given that there might be an invasion, if they're sending Air Force sorties over us, and a given company that's operating certain SAM sites, for every bomber you knock out, we will give you $800,000, or what, I'm making that number up, but
Yeah.
the number wouldn't be arbitrary. They would they would do a cost benefit and just see how much would that be sparing us in expected payouts on the margin, and that's how there would be some rationality there. And so that would help guide the defense effort. Whereas right now, if the government's in charge, you've got a bunch of guys and maybe they went to West Point or something and they served in Iraq or whatever, but it's a bunch of central planners basically saying, we have all these resources at our disposal, what's the best way to use them to stop an invasion, and why would we expect them to be able to do that? If you're familiar with the general critique of economic planning, then it's the same logic here. So here I'm saying there's genuine market prices where the insurance companies can come up with and say, knocking out one bomber is worth $800,000, taking out 100 infantry is worth blah blah blah, and then depending, so that could help guide the efforts.
Well, and not only that, but in the model you're talking about, these guys, whoever's making these pricing decisions, they stand to go out of business if they get it wrong. Whereas in the system we have currently, the military planners, they're not going to go out of business. I mean, the worst that might happen is maybe somebody will lose their position, but that enterprise, if you want to call it an enterprise, it's going to keep going. There's no threat of, bankruptcy for the military industrial complex. So I think that's kind of another.
Right. I mean, if we're talking about like being invaded, I guess you could say the ultimate downside would be if you screw it up, you get taken over by a foreign power.
Yeah, there's that.
And one little asterisk on that. So also, because I have some people, objected to what I was saying, and they were like, well, what's the point of being compensated if some enemy came in and took over your area? But again, if we're talking about people who own skyscrapers, like they would have the ability, they might leave the vicinity and still have international bank accounts, and you know what I mean? So it's even if one city gets devastated, the fact that you had insurance policies with these major corporations that have a global footprint, they would still owe you the money contractually and all that kind of stuff. So there's that. But just to quickly finish the point I was making before, so in this framework where there's still the rule of law and property rights, if the insurance companies either themselves or they delegate it, to some other company, some other company might have its maybe they have sharpshooters all over the place, and like that's what they specialize in, is they have a sniper force and they take out infantry, and they have a schedule of compensation where you take out a general, you get such and such, you take out a corporal, you get blah blah blah. If you plant explosives and take out one of their tanks, this is how much you get. And maybe they would find that they could increase their profits by blowing up key bridges and stuff to slow the enemy advance, so they can get their snipers all positioned to then start taking people out or whatever. They couldn't just do that without cost. They would have to compensate the domestic, their neighbors who own the bridge. So they could still do it. Like, they wouldn't be brought up on criminal charges in this system. I think people would, recognize, the courts would recognize that, okay, yeah, you did that because of the situation. Just like if somebody is starving in the woods and breaks into a cabin and eats their food, they don't just get to do that with no consequences, but they're not going to be charged the same way like a regular home invader would be charged. Like, people would recognize what was going on. So likewise here. And again, that doesn't hamstring the defense effort. That's what makes it more effective. You don't want the army thinking it could just go around blowing up your neighbor, its own people's property, because, well, in our opinion, this helps the war effort. Like, you don't know that. And so the market prices keep you honest and make sure that the efforts are coordinated. Maybe, no, this bridge is really essential for evacuating civilians too. And if you take it out, it slows the enemy advance, but then it means more people get trapped in their side and get captured or killed, or that kind of stuff. So ultimately, and if normal people had policies too that would compensate them in the event that, if you had a life insurance that also paid off in the event of a military invasion, those insurance companies would have something to say. And again, so it's all these different competing interests when you're trying to determine, like, to repel an invasion. Like, one thing you could do is, let the troops come in and then just drop a nuclear bomb and wipe out the invading army. You kill half your population too, but hey, so clearly it's not repel the enemy with no other considerations or criteria. That's not what they're tasked with. And I'm saying market prices that try to make people feel the incentives and realize these are all the competing interests at play. That's how in other arenas we allow for social, rational coordination of activity, and you could bring that to bear even on something like military defense that most people think, well, that has nothing to do with the market economy. And, there's a sense in right, but the defense does. Like, what the invading army's doing, that's not free market, that's not voluntary, but in other words, it's not that all of a sudden coercion is great when it comes to organizing your defense activities. For the same reason that if you want to feed your people, you don't have the government in charge of wheat output. You let the market figure that out, and which, farmland should be devoted to what, and blah, blah, blah. And truckers bringing food to the grocery stores, and how many grocery stores should they be, and where should they be located? Those are all things we leave up to the market, and that feeds our people way better than centrally planning it. And likewise, defending us from a military invasion is important, just like food is important. And so the best way to take our given resources and knowledge and come up with the most potent, efficient defense is to let market forces help, coordinate things.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I don't think you're saying, you were talking about, if they blew up a bridge, they wouldn't necessarily be tried on, they wouldn't be brought up against on criminal charges. I don't think you're saying they would be above the law, that there's nothing these companies could do that would have them tried as criminals. Is that right?
Oh, correct. Right. So they couldn't, if they went out at gunpoint and rounded up 1,000 people and conscripted them and said, you're fighting now for the resistance or else we're going to shoot you. Yeah, I think they would, if they did that, they would be charged with kidnapping.
Right. They're still held to the same laws that everyone else is, right? They're still, there's not a special standard for them.
Right. That's what I was saying. Yeah. So what I was trying to get at with, in the woods, when you break into someone's cabin because you're starving,
it's a special circumstance.
That's different from, like, teenage kids are just bored and they see this thing, hey, let's break in there and see if there's anything good in there. They would be charged differently. But still, even the person who breaks in just because he's starving, when he's back on his feet and back in society, has to, compensate the person for the food he took. Yeah. So I'm saying, likewise, if you blow up a bridge for strategic reasons to slow the enemy invasion, you still have to pay the owners compensation. But you probably would not be charged in that instance with crime. You would just be charged with property damage.
Okay, so I've got a couple more specific questions about the defense thing, but I think this might be a good place to start talking about the rule of law. And how would that happen if you don't have a monopoly state, if you don't have some authority dictating, what the law is and how it's enforced? How do you get that?
Great. Yep. So here I want to kind of like shake people out of, because you're right. There's this like if you think about it in a certain way, it seems like it's an impossible problem. That like, okay, yeah, the rule of law and property rights and even the military defense, yeah, given that we know. But if we don't, don't we need to have an agency that defines the property rights just to even start before then the free market can get going? Like, how could you have the market define property rights if that's one way of thinking about it? Because don't you need to know who owns what in the first place? So I get that issue, and I think that a lot of objectivists, like people following the tradition of Ayn Rand, that's how they come to this, and that's why they conclude anarchism, even the anarcho-capitalist variant of it, doesn't make any sense. And so, but I think there's a logical fallacy in that way of thinking. So let me just warm people up. I think we'd all agree there's definitely, rules of grammar and spelling and punctuation and things like when it comes to the English language, right? It's not that English is arbitrary. There's definitely rules of grammar. There's certain sentences we can all say, yep, that's grammatical or that isn't grammatical. And then we say, okay, so who's in charge of the English language? What group of experts or authority figures dictates to everybody else what the rules of grammar are? And there is no such group of people. Now, there's things like dictionaries and grammar books and style guides, but what those are doing are just codifying what the community's usage shows are the actual rules, right? That if the Oxford English Dictionary came out and said the word up, UP, if that means moving towards the ground, and that's how it defined it in a certain edition, it's not that we would all say, oh, I guess that's what up means. We would say, no, that's wrong. That's not the definition of up. And if they did do that, and especially if they consistently did that, they would go out of business. People would stop buying the Oxford English Dictionary because they would say its definitions are wrong, right? So, again, so it's not that the people publishing the Oxford Dictionary define words. What they do is they codify, they distill down for public reference what the definitions are, and it's not that they made that decision. Okay, so that's what I think the law is, right? It's this organic thing, for lack of a better term right now, that governs human interaction, and that what happens when two parties are having a dispute. And by the way, what I'm saying here, this isn't just me inventing this. This is coming from reading people talking about like how the common law emerged and how law came from Rome and then through England and whatever to come over here to the United States. So that's what I'm just taking that and then kind of elaborating upon it or extending it. But the idea is that when people have a dispute, they can't, someone says, oh, he stole my television set, and the guy says, no, I didn't. That how do you resolve that? And so they can go to a judge and just present their case, and the judge gives the interpretation, gives the opinion. We even use that term opinion.
Yeah.
So it's not that the judge is making the law. The judge is saying, in my opinion, we have this antecedent body of law, and that's how it applies in this situation. And and nowadays in a modern context, with the state being so omnipresent in all of our activities, a lot of people think, from what I just said, like, okay, fine, but the law that the judge is applying is just what a bunch of legislators said. And I'm saying that's a relatively recent bit of hubris in terms of humanity, that historically, no, the law was just this thing independent of human.
Right. I think that's an important.
authorities.
I think that's an important distinction to make between common law and administrative law. I mean, I don't know at what point we started having these professionals who sat in rooms making up laws for everybody. But my understanding of the history of common law is it's as you say, it's it's sort of the collection of people's experience in resolving disputes. But then this other thing came in where it's like these guys sitting in these rooms saying, okay, what laws are we going to come up with, this year, and, impose on these people whether they, want them or not. I think there's a qualitative distinction between those two kinds of law.
Exactly. So for your listeners who are familiar, Friedrich Hayek has a collection called Law, Legislation, and Liberty, and if and so there he's making the distinction between law and legislation that's not redundant, those are the terms that he used to say, law means things like you can't kill people, blah blah. Whereas legislation, he meant things that political officials get together and they explicitly formulate and just say. Issued by fiat, and that's what legislation is. So he was saying, no, the law is ancient, that way back in the day, even if there was like kings or tribal elders or whatever, they would apply the law. They knew stealing is illegal, murder is illegal, and if you said why, they wouldn't have said, well, because I'm the king and I said so. They would just say, because it is. Maybe they would say the gods gave it, or under monotheism you'd say it came from God or whatever, or later they might say natural law. But the idea, being that, no, murder really is illegal, just like 2 + 2 is 4, not because some mathematician said so. It is. Like, a mathematician can grasp it and study it and maybe try to explain it to you, but it's not because the mathematician said so. It is. 2 + 2 is 4. Just like murder is illegal. Whether or not some political officials say, if they say it isn't, then they're wrong, in that conception. And so you're right. I don't remember. I mean, if you'd asked me 15 years ago, I would have given you a better answer, but it's been a while since I've read some of those material. But yeah, at some point in like Europe, it did evolve away from just, the king and, his subordinates administering the common law and, judges making rulings because they just thought there was this pre-existing antecedent body of law that we're just the ministers of or the enforcers of, into more of a, these are the rules because we said so.
No.
And it was somewhat of a gradual. I think it would start in certain cases and then expanded. And also, like, a huge shift, just as an aside, was that crime came to be. You didn't commit a crime against the direct victim. You committed it against the state, and that's why, like, if you're charged in the United States, it's like the people of New York State versus the defendant. It's not the people who had deposits at the bank that got stolen. You think, well, shouldn't they be the ones? Or you kill somebody, it's not that guy's estate bringing a criminal case against you. Maybe it's a civil case, but no, it's the people of New York versus blah blah. Which, again, it's just the government, sticking its nose in and saying, oh, you is a front to us. Which anyway.
Right. So how would this? So we're talking about common law here. We're not talking about administrative law. How in a society without a monopoly on force or a monopoly on the judicial system, how would that even happen? How would? I guess the big question is how, in a nuts and bolts sense. I think it's easy to imagine how there could be judges and courts of law that are competing, that are independent. But when it comes to enforcement, when it comes to actually, okay, this guy is guilty of murder, there's some penalty for that. How does that get enforced in a world where there's no monopoly on force?
Okay, sure. If I could just take a second just to say a little bit more, just to make sure we're not leaving people too skeptical. Yeah. So I alluded to it, like, with math, but math and science, there's all kinds of fields of human enterprise where there's definite objective conclusions or results, things people believe in, and yet they're not promulgated by some authority figure. Right? Again, with math, nobody's in charge of math. Now, there's certain experts and things, but again, and on any given thing, if like some guy solves some theorem that took decades of an unsolved famous math problem, and some guy solves it, the average person in the public, I mean, they might not even care, but even if they do care, they're not in a position, they couldn't read the proof and say, oh yeah, that checks out, good job. Yeah. They have to rely on other math. But the idea is you kind of trust there's enough of independence and competition and rivalry and objectivity in this field that if a bunch of the experts all sign off and say, yep, that's a valid proof, this guy finally did it, Fermat said this on his deathbed and this guy finally proved it, that's probably accurate, right? Even though nobody's in charge of that. There's anarchy in math. And yet, no, it's actually very hierarchical. There's respected journals and whatever. And so I'm saying, likewise, with the law, there would be, different authority figures, experts who would be publishing codes and things and saying, like, this is the way in terms of property theft or property law, this is the procedures that would be used, and this is homicide, and and all kinds of different areas of the law where there'd be experts writing things. But again, it wouldn't be they would just say because I said so. They would have reasoning and whatever, and they would be trying to. And the reason they would become and rise through the ranks among their peers as being a recognized authority is because the people who are experts in that would agree that, oh yeah, that person, the thing he wrote 3 years ago is the definitive work on home invasion. And so if you're ever a judge, I totally like a judge who takes that as the framework and then applies that to the particular facts of the case. To me, that's a really fair, just ruling, right? That's the idea. And then also, if people are familiar with modern day arbitration, that's how I think it would work as well. So people have a dispute, and it's most people think or they say they're right. I think it's we can deal in a minute, Brittany, with cases of like what if someone really is just a bad actor and whatever. But in general, when people have a dispute, it's self-serving bias and whatever. But they're not up there saying, well, I have more guns, and so that's why I'm right. It's more they will come up with self-serving arguments, and then the issue is, well, how do we adjudicate among those claims? And so for them to, I would say, in a typical dispute, like each side would say, I'm willing to submit our disagreement, to a third party here and abide by the decisions, by the opinion that this third party gives. And right now in the real world, that's kind of how arbitration works.
Yeah.
And so how would those people get a clientele? By having a reputation for fairness. Like, so it couldn't be in a divorce proceeding, one judge is always pro-wife or is always pro-husband, because then when a couple's having a dispute, at least one of them would object and say, no, we're not going to that guy because, he's always biased against, my side of the So you would, the only way a judge could stay in business is if he or she has a reputation for being very fair and just applying the law dispassionately. And so I'm saying that's how that would arise. So now just to come back to your question about, enforcement. So here I disagree with a lot of the literature. Well, I don't know if it's a disagreement, but if you go read some of the classic works in anarcho-capitalism, like Murray Rothbard's stuff, like For a New Liberty is, I think, one of his earliest works where he has a chapter on this, and then he's written other stuff. They tend to collapse it into, there's like a defense agency that both has like internal people who make the ruling, and they also have burly guys on the payroll who have guns, and then they go and I don't think that's how it would play out. I think they would be distinct entities in a free society where one, the judge is just a person. I mean, it would have support staff and whatever, but I think the judge would be just like a solo person, or maybe there'd be a company that has a team of judges that anytime someone has a dispute like this and they get referred to us, we figure out whose schedule can who can hear this case most quickly, and boom, there you go. But I think that would be one. Just like right now, law firms don't also have on this payroll security personnel, right? Like the local mall might have security, like mall cops, you know what I mean? Like not actual police officers. And I'm just saying, in practice, law firms don't also run those services out of the same company. You know what I mean? Those are just totally different things. And so I think that's how it would be in a free society where there wouldn't be government-provided police. What would happen is, so I think the guy down the street stole my television set. I say that, we go and I say, hey, I'm willing, and I list like the top 10 in the community, either judicial firms or individuals who specialize in property theft, property crime, and say, I'm willing to submit our case to any one of those 10 you pick. And the guy said, no, they're all crooks. I don't trust those guys. Here, what about this guy? It's his brother-in-law, who no one's ever heard of. Let's take our case to him. The community is going to quickly recognize that, I'm probably in the right. And so then I still go and take the case. And so I go and there's agencies like Property Retrieval Inc. And I contact them. I say, hey, this guy stole my TV. I need you to go. It's in his house. Like I looked in and I see he's watching stuff with my TV. And then I tell them, and they're going to say, well, we need to maintain our good standing in the community. We're not just going to go to this guy's house and break in and take his TV. We need a court order. Show us a reputable judge who has ruled that in his opinion that is your TV, and then we'll go do it. And so then I take my case and it gets tried in absentia. If that guy refuses to show up, I show, my receipt, my footage from the night it was stolen, and it's someone walking out that looks kind of like him, and then I give all the circumstance, and I, that trying to demonstrate it's his. And let's say I have enough evidence that the judge is comfortable saying, yes, in my opinion, he is guilty of stealing your TV, and among other things, he should return the television set and 2 ounces of gold for your time and trouble, and blah blah blah. So that right there, the judge, he doesn't have an army at his disposal.
Right.
He doesn't press a button. That's just his ruling. And now the separate agency, who has a reputation in the community trusts these guys. They're not worried about them being rogue criminals because, oh no, we only will step onto someone's property against their will if we have a valid, or opinion from a respected legal authority. Because it's in their business interest to maintain the trust of the community that they're themselves not a bunch of thieves.
Right.
They show up again. Are they going to kick the guy's door in and shoot up, throw in flashbang grenades and then killing the guy's infant? Of course not. That would be terrible for business. No one would ever go to them again if they did that.
Yeah.
And so instead, they'll wait till when the guy's out of the house, and they'll go in and retrieve the TV that way or something. Or first, obviously, they'll send notices saying, "Hey, we've got this pending thing. You've got 60 days to comply." And then if it doesn't, then. So I'm just saying that's the way I think the system would play out. So you can just see at each step. So as long as there's competition and you notice, it's in everybody's interest in a civilized society. Reputable companies are not going to want to even have the appearance that they're engaging in criminal activity, because that's just bad for business.
Right. And presumably, let's say a company did do something like that, broke down someone's door, killed family members, killed their dog, whatever. That person could then take legal action against them in a way that you really can't against the police. Am I right about that?
Yes. Right.
That they would be held accountable for their own criminal activities. They wouldn't have this, special status, qualified immunity or any other special status that you get just by virtue of being part of that monopoly.
Yeah. Right. So yes, the quick answer is I agree with you wholeheartedly. There wouldn't be immunity, and just because you're in the act of law enforcement, that means all bets are off and you can do whatever you want. And I feared for my life, and that's why I shot that dog. I mean, there could be things where if the carrying out of your standard duties, if certain things happen, just like you can come up with crazy scenarios. Let's say the house is on fire, and the private company that has firefighters on the payroll, and they go there, and someone takes the hose out and sprays it in there. And what if there was someone that they didn't realize, and he was trying to climb out the window, and the water smacks him in the face and kills him? They presumably would be treated more leniently than if some people, it was a mob hit, and they went up and said, okay, well, we're going to kill this guy, get this high-powered hose and just drown him. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
so, obviously, the intention, blah, 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 matter. But right, it's not that simply because you're enforcing property rights that therefore you can do whatever you want. The law doesn't apply to you. No, the law would apply to every. That's again the whole point. There's no privileged group in this system that is above the law. Everyone is subject to the law. So here you really do have the rule of law. It's what's ironic about this. That'll the objectivists and whatever say, oh no, we uphold the rule of law. It's so special to us. We can't bear a system of anarchy where there's no rule of law. It's just whatever's profitable. And I'm saying no, it's only in this decentralized system I'm talking about that the rule of law does get applied to everyone equally. Just like right now, if the president says something ungrammatical, and that happens a lot with Joe Biden, we can all say he just said something ungrammatical. It's not that, oh no, by definition, whatever the president says defines what grammatical use is, right? So the rules of grammar apply to everyone. And likewise, property rights, the rule of title transfer and with the rule of what constitutes a crime and blah, blah, those rules apply to everyone in the system, even the people who are, whose job it is to enforce those rules.
Yeah, that does seem to be sort of a fundamental misconception, I think, or I look at it almost as kind of magical thinking about the state. Like somehow, without really thinking through how this happens, somehow there's this belief that you can get rule of law and you can like genuine rule of law in a system where there's a monopoly. And I think when you look closely, you kind of see what you've just described, which is, well, no, you get this special privileged space for the people who are part of the monopoly, and the rules are different for them, and everyone else, maybe there's rule of law, maybe there's not, but there's this distinction between everyone else and the people in the monopoly. And I feel like that's kind of one of the biggest barriers to break through, because in my view, it does kind of just boil down to this, like, just belief, like a faith-based belief in this monopoly system. But the opposite is actually true.
Right, and at a certain level of abstraction, it could be true or not true in either system, right? So right now, I can imagine people listening to us objecting and saying, "What are you talking about? Biden can't do whatever he wants. Right now, Trump is being tried for blah blah blah." So we're showing the president's not above the law, and the police, if they, what's his name, was it Chauvin?
Yeah,
he got convicted. So the police just can't go around killing. What are you talking about? So yeah, at a certain level of abstraction, yep, there's the rule of law in that system, and then it's a matter of, I would say, just using your analysis to say in practice, which system is more likely to actually have the reality line up with the spirit of what the defender of the system hopes would happen. So just like we can kind of say, in practice, we think that even though on paper the people in the government aren't above the law, I think you and I, Brett, you still think the people in the CIA are not subject to the same laws as everybody else.
Right.
They get away with a lot of stuff that if you or I did, it would be criminal.
Yeah.
Rightly so.
Yeah. And police all the time. There might be a few isolated cases, that's kind of that prove the rule, but you do see crazy things happening at the hands of police. It's like, no, if an ordinary human being did that, they'd be in jail.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And so in this system too, that again with the anarcho-capitalist sketch of that world that I just gave, on paper, like I'm telling you in my story, it works out well, and then you can imagine, and maybe this some of the objections you want to get into about, okay, but what if there's like major wealthy individuals, aren't they going to be able to buy verdicts and things? So theoretically that could happen, and then if we want to get into at some point, talking about why I think the checks and balances would be better in that system than in the first one.
Let's talk a little bit about checks and balances. So that's a good example. And also, like, what happens when you do have like a genuine bad actors, like, people who have no interest, so what you're describing is a system where everyone has an interest in maintaining their reputation in society. But what about people who don't care? What about people who just, want to go around and kill people or, wreak havoc or whatever? How does it work with people like that?
Okay, sure. So maybe we'll do like the crazy axe murderer first, and then do like the rich guy,
and then the
commits crimes and just pays judges,
and then the rich axe murderers.
Yeah, What was that movie? The '80s movie with the the movie about the guy in the '80s, the serial killer, the guy who played Christian Bale.
Oh, I don't know. I don't watch enough movies.
Okay, well, anyway, I can't believe it's not. But anyways, there's certain. It's a cult classic. So some of your listeners, I'm sure, will be like, oh yeah, I can't believe Bob is blanking on the name. But anyway, it was a Wall Street executive guy who also happened to be a serial killer, and it was.
Oh, American Psycho.
Yes.
Is that yes? Okay.
Okay. So, So, and you're right that a lot of what I said, I was appealing to incentives that ultimately came down to like, your goodwill in the community, things like that. So I think partly what would happen is, again, at least in Western societies, like how things would play out if it was like a relatively poor Muslim community might look a lot different. But I'm talking here about a fairly secular, but based on a Judeo-Christian heritage, capitalist society that just goes full ANCAP. And I think the way that would play out is people would get either fraternal organizations or just literal insurance companies would effectively be vouching for you. And so just like right now, like a brain surgeon has malpractice insurance.
Yeah. And
so what does that say? That if it's demonstrated, not just that, something went wrong, but that, no, if he did something that really was not medically appropriate and blah, 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 and that, he's on the hook, but he has insurance to cover that. Okay, and so I think just generalizing that idea, or just with auto insurance, like right now, if you kill somebody or you mess up somebody's car, your insurance pays for it directly,
Yeah.
right? Even if you're at fault. And so likewise, I think just generalizing that concept, I think people would have standard policies, or at least in certain areas, like particularly in big cities where there's a lot of anonymity and people don't know who's who, because it's a big community and you're seeing a lot of strangers day in and day out. I think there probably would be a role for insurance policies like that. So like before an apartment complex would rent you give you a lease for a year or something, besides running your credit, and there still would be credit rating agencies, in this kind of a world, they would also, like, you'd have a standard policy that if you're convicted in a reputable, court system, and this would all be specified in the contract, like, what does it mean to say a reputable,
Yeah.
whatever. If it's just convicted that you did a bunch of damage, or like you assaulted another resident in the property and blah, blah, and it's, if you owe us damages, that you have a policy that covers that. So we know we're good, right? And so, so there, and then maybe, you got, and it's just like with your auto insurance, if you're constantly causing accidents, your rates go up. So likewise here, if you're constantly getting convicted of like beating people up, or, petty theft or whatever, vandalizing the building, and your insurance company keeps covering for that and making everybody whole, it's going to be harder for you to maintain coverage, or at least your premiums are going to go way up. So that's partly, to get you to feel the consequences of what you're doing. So those kind of mechanisms, I think, would work for 98% of the population, and just give people incentives to keep their behavior in line. Again, it's not going to be perfect, but right now in the real world, people commit crimes all the time. It's not the threat of the state finding you, convicting you, and putting you in a cage with some other unsavory people. That's not eliminating crime at all. Right, so it's just a matter of which system. But so now we just focus. Okay, yeah, but the crazy axe murderer, serial killer, what have you, it's not that he wakes up and says, I could go, chop off 10 people's heads today, but gee, my insurance rates might go up. Maybe I won't do that. Like, that's not what's going on with a guy like that. Okay.
Yeah.
So he does it, and so at the very least, among other things you could possibly say, I want to say, keep in mind, in an ANCAP world, every piece of property, every bit of land is privately owned. Like, some of it might be owned by a corporation, or so, it might not be that, oh, Jim owns that. It might be, an entity that has shareholders and whatever. But still, there's no such thing as private property. It's not like there's the public sidewalk that, hey, I have a right to be here like anybody else. No, everything's privately owned, and you can set whatever rules you want as far as who's allowed on my property. So I think in crazy cases like that, where the guy's on video camera, he just walks into a crowd and just starts, taking out a samurai sword and starts killing people, and they go to 10 different judges who all review the footage, and they make sure they identify the guy, and he has no alibi, or he doesn't show up, and it's well understood that yes, this individual is a convicted serial killer or mass murderer. At the very least, every property owner in the area is going to say, you are not allowed on our property. And so wherever that guy finds himself, besides if he owned his own house or something, the people will be able to call, the local security agencies to say, get this guy off my property, right? So I don't need to have a separate theory of under what circumstances is it legitimate for us to physically grab someone and drive him somewhere and put him in a cage. I'm saying everybody can say, get off my land. And I think in that framework, there would emerge a role for institutions that would be like sanctuaries for people like that. And so it could be religiously motivated, or it could just be a business that says, hey, at any given time in this, society, this big city of 10 million people, there's 800 people at any given time that are pariahs because they're like serious criminals, and no one wants them on their property. So, hey, if you're such a person, come here. We're going to pat you down and make sure you don't have any weapons on you. We're going to put you in a very monitored cell and blah, blah, blah. You're going to sign paperwork coming in that says you agree, that you can't come and go as you please, and you're agree to a bunch of stuff. But on the other hand, we're not going to treat you sadistically. You have the right to, transfer to a different one of our competitors. That's part of the clause. And, you have open lines of communication with our competitors. If you feel you're being mistreated once you're in here, that, they can send their representatives and say, do you want to come over here? So there'd be So it would be like the prisons in this world would actually be like hotels
Huh.
competing for the patronage of these people.
Yeah.
But yet they wouldn't. It would be like the Hotel California, right? That once you go in, you can't leave the system. And the only way you would get out that is if one of those agencies again like would vouch for you at some point. So if you really are rehabilitated, and notice, what's the incentive for all this? Again, just pure profit motive. People are not as productive if they're sitting in a cell somewhere. And by the way, if the person could work from within that facility, that institution, they would. They wouldn't have them doing something stupid like breaking rocks or making license plates. That's not productive.
Yeah.
If the guy was an accountant, they would try to come up with a way can he do his accountant work from in here, because right now he's got an $800,000, or it'd be in gold ounces or Bitcoin or something, amount he owes the estates of the people he killed, and he's got to work that debt off.
Yeah.
And so he's not going to do that breaking rocks.
I also wonder what would happen, let's say, again, there's somebody where it's on the record, it's clear this person murdered a bunch of people or murdered one person. Mm-hmm. And I wonder what would happen in a situation like that where it is absolutely clear and the family of one of the people that he killed just goes and takes the guy out. What would the legal consequences be to them? What,
Mm-hmm.
in our current world, they would be in trouble, but would they necessarily in Afghanistan?
Okay, yeah, great question. So, quick answers, I'm not sure, because I can't centrally plan the law. Just like if you asked me how many grocery stores per capita would there be, I don't know. You'd let market forces determine that. So my guess is that I think what would happen is that there would be a legal principle that, like, for example, if someone steals your television set and you take it back, I think the legal ruling, would be that if a reasonable person in your shoes would have been quite certain that was your television set, it's okay for you to take it back. You get what I'm saying? Whereas you couldn't just
bomb their house.
Well, that too, but also you couldn't take someone else's. Like, even if you legitimately got robbed, and then someone down the street had a TV model that was similar to yours, and you went in and took it, and it turned out
you can't just do that.
No, it looked like that you'd be in trouble. But again, I think the specific thing would be you couldn't have been, sure that was your television set, and there's a high burden of proof that you got to be pretty sure before you do something like that. So I think it would be like that, and likewise. So yeah, if somebody kills somebody, then the guys next of kin, I could imagine, legally speaking, would have the right to kill him. There's a lot of tradition in Western society and culture about an eye for an eye, but I think what would happen is so that would be the limit. Like, you couldn't kill the guy's kids. It would just be if he's a killer, you can kill him, but also you couldn't torture him for 3 weeks. That I think it would just be you can end his life, and so that if the family did that on their own, and it would have to be them, right? It couldn't just be some other person who was out. Like, let's say the family is Amish or something and they forgive him. Somebody else couldn't kill the guy and say, well, I'm not letting a murderer live in this neighborhood. Other property owners could say, well, you're a murderer, get off my land. You know what I mean? Like, the fact that they forgave you, good for them, but, get off my property. They could still do that. But they couldn't, shoot him. They say, oh, he was a murderer walking around. That's kind of how I think. And so I think, in practice, the law might say you're allowed to do up to this amount of, retaliation.
Right.
But in practice, I think what would happen pretty quickly is it would just become standard that, the convicted murderer could say, okay, yeah, you have the right to kill me, but what if I gave you $800,000 instead, and you let me work for the next 20 years paying you that debt off? And then, the family would think about it and say, well, that's not going to bring Dad back if we kill him. And, we could do a lot with his money and blah, blah, blah. And also, I think that's better for the convicted individual, you know what I mean? Like, in terms of rehabilitating people, instead of just putting them in a cage. Like, I know we were talking about death penalty, but short of that, like, oh no, he should be sitting in prison for 20 years. That doesn't
help
make
anyone
him become a better person, right? It doesn't help anybody. And then he's like mixing it up with other criminals. Like, that's
they're perfecting the art of being the criminal in that in that
or,
setting.
Maybe being himself abused in there from those other, and then, so then you let them out after 20 years and they're rampaging maniacs.
Right.
So that's just crazy. And so I think a much more humane system that also would tend to minimize recidivism would be that, no, when you're convicted, technically, the family or whoever can do this much in punishment to you, but I think in practice they would just get, you know, a monetary compensation in lieu of that. And I think as that became more widespread, that would just become the civilized thing. So that if somebody ever did
Yeah.
say, like, oh yeah, this guy, you know, in a bar fight broke this guy's arm, and this guy broke both of his arms, because the judge said that you're allowed to do that. I think most people's like, oh, why didn't you just take $300,000? What's wrong with you? What are you know, sick? What's
Yeah.
twisted? So
Yeah.
I think that's kind
Yeah,
of
it creates an
happened at the time.
incentive for more civilized behavior, actually,
Right?
or
Because
civilized
there is,
responses.
yeah, because there is a certain, I don't know, if paradox is the right word, but like to sit, you know, if little kids are growing up and they're like, oh, how come that guy, you know, is being hanged, and say because he killed someone in this community, we don't like killers, and that's why we killed him. You know, like
Yeah, wait a second.
and ultimately, you know, there's some limit to that logic, right? Like if some guy kidnapped a bunch of people and kept them in his basement for 10 years and did awful stuff and then killed him, you're not going to take him and put him in a basement for 10 years and you know what I mean? The most you're going to do is kill him.
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah.
most people realize you're not going to literally just do to everybody what they did to their victims. And so once you admit that, well then, okay, just because they killed someone, why does that mean we need to kill him again? It doesn't bring anybody. But going back to your question, I do think at least in the initial implementation of this, I think because there is a sizable segment of the population who would, you know, who think that no, if somebody kills somebody, you know, either they deserve to die or at the very least the victim's family has the right to claim their life if they so choose. Like you leave it up to them. It's not that the community should impose that choice on them.
Right.
I can imagine that being the legal norm.
Right. And presumably the way this would look from place to place would differ based on, you know, the values of that community. I mean, a place that was full of Amish people, I'm imagining the law and how it plays out would look a lot different from, you know, an East Coast or a West Coast sort of urban environment. I mean, if there really is no monopoly, then it seems like local values would sort of rise to the top wherever you are, and it would look different from place to place.
Right, and precisely because of that, that's why a lot of people recoil from this kind of system that I'm sketching, because it seems arbitrary, and that's I get why like an objectivist gets frustrated with it. It's like, no, like, what you're describing is like saying, you know, in a vegetarian community, the restaurants aren't going to serve burgers, but in another place they are. But that's not because there's anything intrinsically moral or immoral. But if you're a vegan and animal rights person, you would think there would be. But you get what I mean.
Yeah.
Or like chocolate versus vanilla ice cream. Like, oh yeah, it's just profitability, and we're going to cater to what the community wants. But when it comes to matters of justice, there really is an objective right or wrong. And yeah, I mean, I'm Christian. I do think, you know, there's absolutes. But likewise, having a government doesn't solve that, right?
Yeah.
So if you've got a hardcore community of, you know, followers of Islam, and they think that it's illegal for a woman to walk around in a bikini, having representative government and a bicameral legislature and, you know, executive, if it's 99% hardcore Muslims who think that, well then in their system you're going to the government police are going to arrest her and, you know, try
Yeah.
her because she's walking around in a bikini, right? So I'm saying the virtue of a voluntary framework, like I'm saying, is it doesn't allow some people to impose their will actually on others, or things where it's if there's really a high cost, at least that will be expressed, right? So just to give a quick example, so let's say, you know, there's some despised minority, they're much more likely to have their basic rights protected in the kind of framework I'm talking about, even though a lot of people might have thought it would go the other way. They might say, oh no, in a system where there's no absolutes, it's just profit makes right or something, then, you know, why wouldn't the 90% who despise the other 10%, why wouldn't they just, you know, patronize legal systems and whatever, and they have more voting power? But by the same token, okay, if it's a majority rule democratic system, you're going to get the same outcome.
Right.
But the difference is
Right.
the 10%, like it's very costly. Like it depends how extreme we're talking about. But if it's like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, people, it's not illegal to kill. Let's say it's redheads, just, you know, to make it not so inflammatory, right? To just say, oh yeah, like, you can go. It's not illegal to go kill a redhead because they're not, you know, they're not the same thing as other people. That would be a very expensive thing because, like, among other things, redheads would pay a lot, you know, to avoid that outcome. and it would just be very costly, right? Like they work late, employers hire them and whatever, they're productive members. So I'm saying just killing them, and that imposes a lot of costs on the community, or losses, let's say, damages beyond just to the individual who just got killed. And I'm saying a market system like I'm describing, though, that has ramifications. Other people feel that more so than in a society where it's just, we vote, and then that's what the outcome is.
And there's also something about this whole idea of imposing a one-size-fits-all solution on an entire nation of people who have different cultures, different values, different beliefs. It's never going to make everyone happy. And I think that just seems so obvious to me. You're not going to be able to impose these one-size-fits-all rules that's going to make for a happy, harmonious, big, huge group of people. And yeah, you can believe that, my view of morality is the right one, or, that this is some objective truth. And I think there are objective truths too, but I think the ones we can agree on are things like, murder and theft and that kind of thing. Beyond that, I think there's something, I think it's always going to just lead to more conflict to try and find one view of justice or morality that's going to fit everyone, because it's not. I mean, you could take the example of abortion, and definitely don't want to go down that, trail, but it really comes down to it's a clash of fundamental values, and you're just not going to get, in this country especially, you're not going to get everybody to be on one side or the other side, and to try and impose, I feel like, to try and impose one view of what the right answer to that is across the country, it's just going to result in more conflict and more divisiveness, as opposed to having, different communities, where the downside of that is you have to know that, across the border, these people are doing something that I find morally objectionable. And there are all these other communities all over the place doing things I find morally objectionable. But which is worse, living like that, or trying to, force everybody into one box?
Yeah, and what you just said ties into a point that I wanted to make sure we got across in this episode, that the people thinking, like, again, with that objectivist mindset, and I keep going back to that because I just recently saw at the Soho Forum, it was Brian Kaplan and, I'm blanking on the guy's name now, but the head of the Ayn Rand Institute.
Oh, yeah, okay. I can't think of his name either, but I know who you mean.
And so, and they were arguing just over this stuff. And so again, they seem to think that right now in the real world with states, we have the rule of law. And no, we don't. Even in the United States, some states have the death penalty and other states don't.
Yeah.
Right. So we don't have a single body of law that's applied equally to all Americans. It depends which state you're in. And then certainly the laws change if you leave the U.S. and go into Canada or Mexico.
Yeah.
Right. And so ultimately, to be consistent, the person saying, oh, you need the state to have a monopoly to enforce the rule of law because there's objectives and we don't want to just leave it up to the whims of the local population. You would need to have one world government that would impose a uniform law code to everyone on Earth.
Right.
And most people don't, I mean, some people might think that's ideal, but most people think, no, it's okay if people across the globe have a different government that they set up, and I recognize, even if they use procedures that I think are democratic and blah, 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 the specific, details of their legal code are going to be different from what's over here. And most people kind of, they're okay with that. And I'm saying, all right, well, that's what would happen under a voluntary decentralized system. Yeah, no matter which city you went to, whatever ANCAP city you went to, murder is going to be illegal. But in some of them, maybe public nudity is going to be illegal, whereas in other ones, it won't be. Who knows? Or other ones, like, you can't be walking around shooting up heroin on a bench out in the public view, and maybe other places you could, whatever. But the idea is that community standards and things, that's all going to find its expression in those codes.
I wanted to get back to one thing you were talking about, the whole idea of insurance coverage as sort of a way of vetting people, and like if you don't have good coverage, if you've committed crimes or whatever, your insurance coverage isn't going to be great. A hotel's not going to want to take you in. People aren't going to want to do business with you. It starts to sound a little bit like a social credit system. So how do you distinguish between the two.
Right, and I'm glad you asked that. And also, too, let's try to remember not forget to come back to the what if the rich guy just
Yes,
pays judges
yes.
to rule in his favor.
Yeah.
But yes, so you're right, because what I found hilarious. So I wrote this stuff up when I was in grad school. So this was the early to mid 2000s, and early 2000s, and it was funny that the conversation, and I would be arguing this stuff on internet forums and things, and it would typically start out with, oh yeah, you'd have this completely lawless society where anything goes, and there'd be axe murderers running around, and children just going into the local CVS and getting heroin and blah blah blah, and it would just be crazy. Might makes right, and there'd be no rule. And then I would start going through and describing my system, and by the end of it, they'd say that's a totalitarian nightmare. In your framework, to even get into the local mall, you'd have to flash your credentials and show your papers at Checkpoint Charlie just to get in and go to the mall. This is what a totalitarian. I wouldn't want to live under your unfree society, Murphy, where corporations control, micromanage. So I'm just saying, notice those are two completely opposite objections, right?
Yeah.
So having said that, though, again, it's going to sound like I'm trying to say, oh, my system has the best of everything, haha. But I think yes, we don't want there to be the Chinese system where if you criticize the government, then you get dinged, and then hotels and stuff won't rent rooms to you and whatever. Or if you don't have enough carbon credits, or if you do things that you get dinged. We don't want that, right? That's totalitarian micromanagement of your day-to-day life, and that's creepy. But on the other hand, again, we don't want wild recklessness. And so, like, if you're a lender and you're deciding whether or not to give a loan to somebody, I think most of us are okay that there exists such a thing as a credit score, right? And it's completely voluntary, right? These and agency, and there's competition among them, but they just keep track of your debts and whatever. And so you could say, I don't want that. And then they can say, okay, fine, but no major credit card is ever going to give you a card, and no bank's going to give you a loan or whatever if you've never agreed to, this kind of thing. So I think, again, likewise in the system I'm describing, once we stipulate what the basic property rights are, no one's forcing you to do anything. But you could imagine, in certain settings, again, if you're the apartment owner and some random guy shows up and you have no idea who he is. Like, I think most people, are you okay with if they do a background check just to see, is this guy, from a neighboring community where there's pending, judgments against him that, oh yeah, he robbed a bank 200 kilometers away, and now he came over here and he's trying to rent a room. Well, no, I don't want you renting, so I think it's just a matter of competing interests that, yeah, on the one hand, you as an individual don't want a bunch of other people prying into your business and thinking every little thing I do is going to have some impact. But on the other hand, other types of businesses realize we got to protect the people in our organization, and we can't let antisocial individuals come in here without some kind of filter on the front end. And I think the trade-off between those two desires to say, well, what's the right line? I think it depends on a case-by-case basis. And again, putting it into a voluntary competitive framework, you're going to get, the outcome that caters to the most people and what their preferences are. So probably like in a small community where everyone kind of knows each other, and there's not a lot of drifters coming and going. Maybe when you go to apply for an apartment, they actually wouldn't say, well, you got to have a policy by a reputable insurance company, because they would just know, we've been running this place for 8 years, and only once has there ever been an issue, and so we're not going to annoy most of our customers for some rare thing that's probably not going to even matter. They could do
Right. Right.
Just like maybe a better, more practical example for people is, if you've noticed, if you're like in a suburb and you go to buy baby formula in the Walgreens or something, it's up on the shelves. But if you're in a rough neighborhood and you go in, it's behind the glass. You know what I mean? You got to go to the front and ask for it. Yeah. And that's inconvenient or whatever, but you can understand why the store's doing that in a high crime area. And so I think it's a similar kind of thing here where, businesses would respond appropriately. And if it really isn't an issue, then they wouldn't have those screens up or those extra checks. But, and certain,
Well, you'd also think that, if your experience of using your insurance as a way to, to vet yourself for people you want to do business with, if your experience of that feels like a totalitarian nightmare, you might switch insurance companies. or you know, there's it's in this system. It seems like the individuals have a voice, whereas you know in China, you don't have a voice. You don't have, you know, there's no feedback loop for the people who are being social credited upon,
Right.
to sort of voice their objections.
Right. Yeah. Just to extend what you're saying. Right. Because partly what's going on with, you know, the Chinese system, and then in the U.S. how they're trying to unveil it, and I think, you know, like the World Economic Forum and those characters are all involved. They're lying, right? They want to implement it like with the Vax ID,
Yeah.
right? They weren't trying to stop the spread of coronavirus. That's not what the point of those was.
Yeah.
The point was to track people, and they knew, oh yeah, just try to get a national ID card that everyone's got to carry around to get on a plane, whatever. The American public's not going to be for that, so let's do the Vax passport instead, or the Vaxport. Was that what they called it, Vaxport?
Vax
So-
passport. Yeah. Whatever.
I think they had some. I mean, not the
Cute.
authorities, like the libertarians who were against it. Like I think they called it Vaxport, like just a. But anyway, it was all a farce, right? It wasn't about.
Yeah.
And I'm not even taking a stand on COVID and the effects of it. I'm just saying, the authorities were not implementing a lot of those rules and procedures because they were just lying awake at night, like, oh my gosh, Grandma's going to catch this, and what can we do to help her? That's not what was going on.
No.
And so that's partly why people recoil against that stuff, is because we know it's phony and they're lying to us and they're unveiling these things or unrolling them for other reasons. Like CBDC is not to prevent fraud. It's to be able to track people and to be able to shut them out of the commerce. You know what I mean? That's why
Yeah.
they're doing it. And so, yeah, with this stuff, there would be genuine competition. And so, yeah, if there were different, you know, like there could be rating agencies, like beyond just a credit score, but just in general, like your law and order score or something, which sounds eerily similar, but at the very least, it would be accurate. It would be classifying stuff that other people would plausibly care about.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That like
Yeah.
a potential employer or whatever, if it's going to say, oh yeah, this guy, and you know he eats a lot of beef and that has a lot of carbon emissions. Someone who's thinking
Right.
about hiring you to work in their factories, I don't care. You know, now
Yeah.
in his previous job, did he get into fist fights all the time? I care about that. And so that's the kind of, you know what I mean? So they would
Yeah.
do things
The
like that.
incentives line up. The incentives line up to produce something kind of sane.
And like and like you said, there's also the flip side, that the people being surveilled or investigated or reported upon, you know, they also would have an interest in privacy, and so those companies would only maintain stuff that, you know, in the interplay between the two. You know, in other words, you might say, hey, what business of it is yours, my credit agency, that I got into 6 fist fights in my last job? And they would say, well, because for our business model, employers are only going to care about our reports if we include stuff like that. If we didn't include that, we would go out of business, and they would cater to reporting agencies that do tell them if you got into fist fights at your last job. So yeah, that's a pretty relevant thing. And then you as an employee, you might say, well, I'm going to shop around. But if all the major agencies are like, no, if you got in a fist fight in your last job, we got to tell the potential employer that, then you would realize, okay, if I want to work, and you wouldn't need to use that. You could say, okay, well,
Oops. You just froze up. Oh, there you're back. You froze up for a second there.
okay. So, but again, even there, it's not that it's imposed on you. You could just say, okay, fine. Well, you know, screw you guys. I'm going to go find, you know, a sole proprietor and talk to the owner and say, you know, yeah, you know what? I don't have reporting agencies. I did get into a fight in the last job, but you should have heard what the guy, you know, the guy was sleeping with my wife. And the guy was like, dude, really? Okay, yeah, well, I'll give you a shot. If you start a fight here, you're gone. But okay, I'll give you a shot. You get what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
nobody's being forced. It's just different groups have their, but yeah, no one's going to be maintaining records of things that really have nothing to do with the ostensible purpose just because they're snoops or trying to spy on you, because that would go out of business.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's get back to the rich guy who pays the judges to rule in his favor.
Right. Okay. So, what's funny about that objection is, so it's a valid objection, a concern, but what's funny is it seems like the implication is, because right now when we had the state running the court system, there really is one rule of law that applies to everybody, and rich people are prosecuted with just as much zeal and vigor as the lowly, you know, poor homeless guy. When of course, no, everyone knows in the current legal framework, if you're wealthy, you can afford really good lawyers and whatever, and you're going to be able to beat cases that someone without as much as much means would be prosecuted, would be convicted on, right? So right now it's not the case that a rich person isn't able to evade the consequences of illegal activity more than a poor person, right? So it's just as always a matter of degree between which system do you think is more susceptible to that. So in a free society, again, the way the judge, again, in the typical case, it's not, this is another thing I haven't highlighted, the distinction. Right now, if you get charged with a crime and you go before a court, you have no role in who your judge is. That's just a sign, right?
Yeah.
And so even if that judge has a notorious history of corruption and making terrible rulings that the public can kind of see, that's crazy. What a crazy ruling. If it's a place where the judge is due to election, you can try to vote the guy out or something, but, there might be a political appointee. It's a very tenuous, like the mayor, when two people are running for mayor, the fact that one judge in that city's framework made a crazy ruling 2 years ago, that's not going to determine the outcome of that election.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
everything just gets all bundled together. Whereas, again, in this more decentralized framework that I'm talking about, the way a particular judge maintains his or her livelihood is both parties to the dispute have to submit to it ahead of time and say, yeah, I'm willing to go before this judge. Are you? Sure. Yeah. And so if it were, documented that, oh, yeah, occasionally this judge, whenever there's rich clients, tends to rule in their favor, even if we didn't see the paper trail, it just looked like, it seems kind of funny that rich defendants always get off with this guy, even when it looks like there was a smoking gun case against them. Then, other people, when they're plaintiffs against a rich defendant, are going to not agree to that judge. Right. And so that's, the way it would work, that, yeah, at any given time, certainly people are susceptible to bribery or whatnot. But if your whole
There's a cost to it for them.
Right. You're more likely to be punished. Whereas in the current system, again, at best, it means, that might be something that would anger people. And in the next election, maybe that's going to be used against you. But, people aren't going to remember that 2 years later. And, so anyway, I think the penalties for corruption are much lower in practice in the current system than it would be in the kind of one that I'm describing.
Yeah. I've got a bunch of other sort of what about. One really sort of targeted specific one gets back to defense, because I hear this objection sometimes, which is nuclear weapons exist. We're not going to get rid of them. Isn't it safer for humanity? Isn't it better that they're held by governments, that we have this way of limiting who gets them, and there are very strict controls on how they can be used? If we didn't have those governments, the nuclear weapons are still there. Wouldn't anybody have access to them? And how would you? It just seems like that would be a very dangerous thing to have this terrible technology available to anyone with no controls on it. How do you respond to that?
Okay, sure. So one thing is to say, in the last 150 years, the biggest mass murderers have been political states.
Yeah.
Right. So in terms of what's the last, I would rather plumbers or electricians or soccer players have control of the nukes rather than politicians. Ultimately, right? Like in terms of, or let's say political rulers, because in some countries, was Stalin a politician? I wouldn't use that word for him. So there's that, but I get the premise, the idea being, shouldn't there be strict legal limits on who can control these things? And then, given that we have a world dominated by states, doesn't that mean that the state should be in control? So the way I would handle that in my framework is, again, going back to the basic framework, that the way you would interact with other members of society, other institutions, is I think you'd have an insurance company or fraternal organization or whatever it's going to be called vouching for you. And so likewise, if you're some company that wants to buy a factory and start processing uranium and building really powerful weapons, I think in order for an insurance company to sign off on that, to say, yes, if this company is convicted of causing damages to anyone in the community, we will pay that off and then we'll deal with them ourselves. They're going to have rules in place. Like say, well, no, if you have equipment on your premises that could possibly kill 1 million people, then we're going to be on the hook for those legal damages. There's no way we're going to vouch for you. I don't care what you pay us in premium. That's too risky. And so I think that's the way things like that would play out, that you would see the legal. So effectively, I don't think private organizations would be legally allowed to hold, super aggressive weapons that, if misused, could cause widespread carnage. So there might be like tactical nukes that could be used defensively, but in terms of, do we need to have the ability to blow up a whole city? I don't think that would legally happen in the kind of world I'm talking about.
It wouldn't be insurable.
Right.
I mean, there was an argument. I remember when Fukushima happened, and there was an argument at that time that, and I believe it was the case that nuclear power, at least that nuclear power station, was not insured. That it's not insurable because of exactly what you're talking about, the high degree of risk. Do you know if that's the case?
I know about the U.S. I don't know over there like what their deal was, but yeah, in the U.S., one of the issues with developing, building more nuclear plants was apparently with the regulation and the liability, and that's why a lot of pro-nuclear people wanted, the legal code to be changed. That yes, like you're saying, I think a lot of insurers, would not put themselves on the hook for that because, geez, if something goes wrong, there's a potentially open-ended liability. And so they wanted, the pro-nuclear people wanted government rules, kind of like with the vaccine stuff.
Yeah.
Say, hey,
don't hold us accountable for the harm we do.
So right. So it's, now I can't speak to, like I've talked to some pro-nuclear people that agree with the limits, but they say, no, it's common sense things. Like if you knew enough about the science and blah, blah, you'd see that, what we're talking about is quite reasonable. It's more like just not giving the jury the ability to say, oh, that's $1 trillion in damages, when really it's not, that kind of thing.
Right.
So I don't know enough to weigh in on whether it's right or wrong. I'm just saying, in the free society that I'm talking about, the legal damage, liability would be sensible. And if it turned, and I think in practice that, so whereas a nuclear power facility, if it's got safeguards and whatever, poses not a very big threat to the population. Whereas if you have a bunch of things that if some group broke in, or if just the people running this organization went rogue and they wanted to, they could kill millions of people. That I don't think any third party would want to say, yep, we vouch for them and we're on the hook legally for any damage they cause.
Yeah. Okay, one of the biggest objections I hear all the time is, this has never been tried historically. There are no historic examples of anything like what you're talking about. So this is crazy. It never has been. It never can be. How do you address that?
Okay, so if I want to be glib about it, I can say, well, good. So this way, at least we know it's not a demonstrated failure. In contrast, your proposal, typically the person I'm talking to, of limited constitutional government, we know that doesn't work. Because, look at who we had. We had Samuel Adams and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and they all got together and gave us this great system, this great experiment, and it blew up in our face. So you really think we're going to reboot and have a bunch of founding fathers that are better than those guys were to give us Constitution 2.0, and this time we mean it? Right? So I'm going to say, if you're going to use lessons of history, you can say limited government clearly does not work. It's been tried hundreds of times. It always has failed. Always. 100% failure rate. And so, I could, again, being glib, I could say at the very least, the system I'm saying, it's not that there was some society that we could point to that, oh yeah, that was doing what Murphy wanted, and then 50 years later, it's a big state that took over or something. So less glibly, it's true. No one society has ever had all of the attributes I'm talking about, but each particular thing I'm saying, there are analogies, just like in this conversation we've been having. I would try to say, like with the medical malpractice, right? Like it really is the case right now that for you to drive your car, you need to get insurance that, vouches for you and says, yep, if this guy causes damage with his vehicle, we will make the person good. And otherwise you can't drive on the road. So I think, that's just a standard thing to say in a free society. It would be similar. The owner of the road would say you need to have a policy. So a lot of these things are like that. And again, with arbitration, you see that right now. There's private security in terms of personnel. I think there's more people employed privately in security right now in the U.S. than there are public sector police forces. Okay, so
Wow.
their legal standing's different, but I'm just showing it's not that everyone just sits back and says, "Oh, we have the police to protect us." That no, lots of organizations know the way you actually protect your person and property and your employees and stuff is you have private sector employees, with that function. It's just they're not government police. So, again, with all these things, the ratings agencies, like things with Amazon and stuff, like, I think that shows a real world application of, well, gee, what if you send money to someone and they don't send you your books or your merchandise? Well, that could happen, but they have rating systems, and in practice, it's pretty good. Whereas if I told you how Amazon.com worked before it was a thing, you could imagine a lot of people saying, that would never work. Are you out of your mind? You're just going to send money to random people 200 miles away and just hope they send you their stuff? That's not going to work. And yet, it does work, right? So I realize a lot of this stuff, if I say the whole system at once, sounds crazy, but if you just think of each little component of it, it's not crazy, and we do see real world analogs of that already, and I'm just kind of combining it all into one thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Why do people tell anarcho-capitalists to go move to Somalia?
So yeah, this is a very popular thing. So Somalia per se, I don't think is so unfair, and I'll come back to that in a second. But in general, yeah, people will point to, like recently I saw someone say, "Oh, if you like free markets, go to Gaza right now because there's no government." And again, my point was, yeah, a region being completely obliterated by a government right now is showing this is what it looks like if there's no government involvement. Like, that's just crazy.
Yeah.
So with Somalia, in fairness to there, it really was a genuine period of statelessness. When I forget the guy's name, when the previous dictator fell, and then there were squabbling clans and things, but there was no other government that was established in his absence, and so it was genuine statelessness. So it wasn't a picnic, but you know what? Somalia under anarchy was better than Somalia with a state. Okay, and so again, with all these things, you got to do apples to apples.
By what measurements?
Life expectancy, literacy rates, one that maybe doesn't strike people as particularly important, but like cell phone usage per capita, various metrics that, and also too, so Ben Powell has an article on this if you want to look that up and put it in the show notes page.
Yeah.
It's Powell is how you spell his last name. And also too, he did it like a comparison of Somalia with some of the neighboring countries, and just showed over time. And so it's not only that in absolute terms Somalia did better when their government fell, because you might just say, oh well, in general humanity progresses or whatever, but no, that the rate of improvement, like Somalia compared to its neighbors, Somalia's relative standing improved when their government fell. And why did their government fail? It's not because everyone read Rothbard. It's because the guy was so corrupt and it was such an awful regime that it collapsed under its own weight. Okay, so it's not surprising that taking away that awful parasitical regime and leaving it with nothing, those people did better off, right? And so again, but it's to point to that and say, see, that's what happens when you take away the government. It's like, no. Well, again, so for one thing is, yep, they were better. So Somalia does live up to the claim, which is take a given group of people, other things equal, you take away their state, they're going to be better off. Somalia actually fulfills that. Now that, again, the claim is not for any group of people with a state compared to any other group of people without a state, the latter's better. That's not what we're saying.
Right.
Right. And so it's like if I say it's good for a basketball team to pass the ball around and not just have one guy, take all the shots. And you could say, oh, so the Chicago Bulls with Michael Jordan, if he just took the shots all the time, isn't going to be able to beat a high school team if they pass the ball a lot? Well, no, the Bulls would win, but I'm saying other things equal, right? So the Chicago Bulls, if they pass more, is better than the Chicago Bulls if Jordan just shoots every shot, right? And so likewise, yeah, the U.S., if you take their state away, we're going to be way more productive and better and peaceful than Somalia without a state. Okay, so that's,
Yeah, it's apples to oranges. Really quickly, because I realize how little time we have left. If you can quickly address the issue of how do you prevent a new monopoly state from rising up?
Okay, so I can't guarantee that, right?
Yeah.
Humans have free will. There's nothing that would necessarily prevent you from forming a state. Depending on your view of history, whether you believe in the literal Genesis account or whether you believe in more of an evolutionary thing, at some point there wasn't what we think of as human government or states, let's say, because government could be a more generic term.
Yeah.
But political states of the kind we mean, those definitely started at some point in human history, right? And so if there was a period when humans existed and they didn't have the political course of state that we have in mind by that term, and then later it existed, clearly that shows states can come into existence, right? And so I can't prevent that and say, oh, because of clause 8 on my contracts, well, what if people just ignore them, right? So I can't prevent that, but what I can say is I think if you had a system like I'm talking about up and running, it would be very robust to the emergence of a new state. And so I think what's really crazy is to start with a limited state and assume it's going to stay limited, right? Because it's very easy, especially when the state is in charge. Oh, we have a Supreme Court. And so when we're accused of violating our prerogatives, we turn to the justices we appointed and said, hey, did we break the law? And they say, no, you didn't. Okay, good, great. I'm glad we got that straightened out.
Yeah.
And, we took away these people's guns. Does that violate the Second Amendment? No, it doesn't. Okay, phew. Okay, great. Right, that's what's ludicrous. Whereas if you don't have that apparatus and it's all competing organizations with a general decentralized rule of law where nobody's above the law, it's hard for one organization to kind of rise and dominate the others. And to kind of go back to like say, oh, well, wouldn't the dominant defense agency just turn into the state? They could try, but everybody would at least recognize that they were criminals. The state right now, it's not merely that they have guns and they point it, and I think a lot of libertarian types miss this sometimes, that they're real jaded and they say, oh yeah, the reason the government can do XYZ is because they have more guns than people. No, they have legitimacy. Now you might think it's misplaced, and so do I, but the general public does not view the mayor's office is the same thing as like a mob boss headquarters, right? That certain libertarians do, but that's not the general population. If the general population thought that, the mayor wouldn't be a ruler anymore. He would lose his authority. So I think people underestimate that in order for a group to rise above, and then they would have to gain some legitimacy, and it would be hard to go from a situation of anarcho-capitalism to one group coming on and taking over all those powers that we traditionally associate with a nation state, and not having anybody along the way say, wait a minute, you guys are violating your prerogatives, you can't do that, you're a criminal.
Right. Yeah, especially if you've got this established rule of law where everyone is held accountable, and suddenly someone rises up and is like, well, no, we don't want to be held accountable. We're going to do our own thing. It's like, I think people just based on their own experience would have a problem with that. I would think.
And also, just to elaborate or extend what you said, I think the fact that there would be competing agencies providing the same type of service would be critical. So right now, you go to a restaurant, you go to a fast food place, and you get food poisoning. People can be mad at that chain and say, hey, watch out, community, don't go to Burger King because I got a Whopper the other day and I got real sick and da-da-da. They wouldn't say, oh, well, next time you're hungry, I guess you're just going to stay home then. You know what I mean? Like, they wouldn't talk like that because there's other competing places. Whereas if people say, hey, the cops last week, they took that suspect into custody and they broke his arms, I don't think they should have done that. You'll get a lot of people saying, oh, well, next time someone's breaking into your house, I guess you're just going to deal with it yourself and not call the cops, right?
Right.
And the reason they think like that dichotomy, it's all or nothing, is because there's one agency, the police, that do that. But if there were 10 different police organizations providing the services and one of them was consistently more aggressive than the other 9, it would make sense to say, hey, instead of patronizing this 10th one, let's do these other 9. And it wouldn't be you're either choosing between having laws enforced at all or cops who break your arm just because you mouth off to them.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on Javier Milei and whether is he a real anarcho-capitalist? Are you hopeful?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm biased because in an interview he literally cited chaos theory.
Oh wow!
Somebody was asking him. From my point of view, he was like, Robert Murphy, chaos theory. But so I don't know what he said, but I think it was favorable. And so yeah, I mean, he really does know anarcho-capitalism. He's not just bluffing. And again, why would you bluff in some?
Right. Right.
Although he won, so I guess you could say maybe he did realize that no, the time is right. What the people want is an
That's
anarcho-capitalist
quite a
president.
gamble, I think.
Yeah, and I'm going to pretend to be it, even though actually I'm a minarchist.
Yeah.
So I do think that he actually is an ANCAP, and he's a trained economist. Like, people don't know his background. He's a professional economist. He's worked for major banks and stuff. So
Okay.
he's definitely in that vein and has read the literature and knows the theory and believes in it. So I don't know. I don't know him personally. I know a lot of people who are close, to him. Like, I interviewed this guy Nicholas Kachanowski, who was one of the co-authors of the proposal to get rid of their central bank and to dollarize. So I know a lot of people that are, I'm like one or two layers of separation from him, and a lot of them are very complimentary, and they're hopeful that so like when the people on the left are accusing him now of being a fascist and whatever because he's like saying, oh, if you're protesting and blocking traffic, we're going to arrest you. And so like the left say, oh, look at this, so he's right-wing fascist. And I know a lot of people who are coming out and defending him. And so I don't know him personally. I haven't followed his career or anything, but I definitely can say he knows the material. He's not bluffing about that. And a lot of people who I respect are hopeful, like, let's see if this guy can really pull this off. They don't think it was like some cynical thing, and oh yeah, he's going to get in there and disappoint us just like everybody else does.
Yeah, he did say he was going to get rid of the central bank, and I think people had the sense that was going to happen like on day one, and it hasn't happened yet. And
right,
what do you think about that? Do you think he's broken his word on that?
So I don't know. I agree with you. Like, he was having a chainsaw and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it seemed pretty bombastic. Having said that, though, he did publicly endorse the dollarization plan. Like I said, this guy, Nicholas, and I forget what his co-author's name was. In their proposal, like, it was written, a few years ago, so it was before Javier was a thing, or a front runner at least. It was a laborious process. It wasn't just on, next Thursday we get rid of the central bank, because the deal was all of the existing banks, all of their assets like on reserve with the central bank were denominated in the local currency. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you can't just snap your fingers and switch the whole thing over. Just like right now, imagine if we were going to get rid of the Federal Reserve, and instead of everybody using dollars, we were going to use Swiss francs or something. That would be hard to pull off in 1 month, like that transition.
Yeah.
Without disrupt. So that's what the feedback I've gotten on that. So again, I don't know. Was his campaign rhetoric? Did he leave that open to nuance, or like did he lead his supporters to believe, no, we're really gonna on day one get rid of that thing? I don't know, because I don't speak the language, and I haven't been able to see what his commercials were like.
But it sounds like that wouldn't have been a realistic thing to promise anyway.
Right, and what I can say is, that he publicly endorsed this plan for this is the blueprint we're going to use for the dollarization, and if you went and read that, it was clear this was going to be a drawn-out process.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah. Okay, we've gone close to 2 hours now. Is there anything? I mean, we could probably go on and on and on, but is there anything else? Is there anything critical we've left out? Anything that big misunderstandings people have? Anything that needs to be addressed?
Well, it's a fun. Can we talk about the mafia? Like, when the mafia just take over?
Yeah.
Because this is a good one. Like, I think that just kind of underscores how, if you study free market economics, you have a certain insight into this. So right now, and again, I'll use the U.S. as the place where I'll make my points in reference to, since that's the history I know. But in the United States, what are the sectors where the mafia or organized crime in general thrives? It's all those that are either literally prohibited or heavily regulated by the state. Right?
Yeah.
So prostitution, gambling, illegal narcotics. And back in the 1920s, when alcohol was illegal,
right,
that's where Al Capone was a bootlegger and all that stuff, right? Once they legalized alcohol, it's not that organized crime had anything to do with liquor anymore. Okay, and so as an economist, you can study that and try to figure out why that is, and then go through and say, well, yeah, because when it's illegal, there's market share, and there's incentive to, like, the costs and benefits of taking out your competitor, because this is my area where I'm going to sell the whiskey in this region. Those those numbers, the incentives are different if it's illegal and the only people selling the whiskey are by definition criminals.
Right.
Who, to be able to stay in business, must have networks in place where they pay off the cops and pay off the judges. Like if the community knows, oh yeah, you need liquor, you go to that guy. Well, the cops know that too. So the only reason you're going to be able to persist in there is if you're paying them off.
Right. Right.
And so, you know,
right. So you've already paid sort of the entry fee to the world of criminality, and so you might as well, you know, be committing crimes.
Right, on the margin.
Real crimes.
Yeah, on the margin for you then to occasionally shoot people is not that qualitatively different because you already going to have the police and the judges on your payroll and whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're a law-abiding CEO, you know, Anheuser-Busch, and you're at a board meeting and they're like, okay, we're going to unveil a new product line and whatever, and let's make sure we don't have, you know, commercials involving trans people because that pisses people off apparently. And oh, and by the way, why don't we go do a drive-by and kill the shareholders of Heineken? Maybe that will be good. It'll be like, what are you, out of your mind? Why would we do that? You know what I mean? Like we're running a reputable business here. That would expose us to all kinds of risk. So, and also the margins are smaller, right? When it's a reputable legal business, the markup from what you pay wholesale to get the product and then resell it,
right,
the markup's not that big. So to capture 2% more market share doesn't mean that much. It's not worth killing somebody over. Whereas, to have the rights to sell cocaine in this neighborhood based on what I pay the Colombian drug lords for the product and then what I resell it for, you know, you're mostly getting paid for the risk of being that, you know, middleman. That's what you're getting compensated for. And so, to take somebody out might mean you make an extra $300,000 a month. And yeah, I'd kill somebody for that. I mean, not me, but the person could. Right. So I'm just saying, so just more generally, that's kind of the idea. And so it's precisely in those areas where the state comes in and outlaws or heavily regulates, quote, legitimate business people from operating in, that the mafia thrive. Right, because
the regulation creates those profit margins.
Right.
They wouldn't exist without that.
And so then one way of thinking about an anarcho-capitalist world, if you want, it's like if the state is still there but legalized everything. And so some people think, if everything's legal, that means the mafia is going to run everything. And I would say, no, that means the mafia would run nothing.
Right. Go out of business.
The current level with the state regulating some things and legalizing others, the mafia thrives in those sectors that are heavily regulated, not in the things that are wide open. The mafia doesn't run dry cleaning operations because there's no margin there. You know, people really need to have dry cleaners just like they really like to drink, but if there's no, you know. So anyway, that's
a really good point. That's a really good point. Okay, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. And I've got a bunch of stuff to link to. I'll link to your chaos theory and what is your website? How do people keep current with you? How do they know what you're doing?
I guess I would point people to my podcast probably. So BobMurphyShow.com is the place to go. I do have a personal site, but I won't even mention it because I haven't updated that in a while. So I would just say BobMurphyShow.com if you're into the kind of stuff I've been talking about. That's the place to go. Okay, and you're on Twitter. I don't think you're not on Substack or anything else, right? You're just right. Twitter, I'm Bob Murphy Econ. Okay. Thank you so much. Well, thank you.
aqui no meu segundo de preferência.
Consensual, tá? Foi só isso que o Castanhari fez. E aí é lógico que o Thiago Braga ia ter que dizer que isso não é bem
Pois é.
assim, ou
Consensual por parte de hoje, do Brasil? Qual academia? Qual academia que você consenso? É porque o Humberto Matos, ele fala e ele anda, né? Tipo, ele deixa um pedacinho de cocô e ele sai andando todo cagado e gritando que ele é o homem mais limpo do mundo. É consenso em qual escola assim... Pessoal, é porque você não sabe o quão difícil é achar consenso na maioria das áreas, mas em história em específico. Cara, é muito difícil achar consenso em história, cara. Vocês não tem noção, velho. É muito difícil achar consenso em história, velho. E a escola brasileira, ela nem é uma referência quando vai falar de Coreia, por exemplo. Então não sei de que consenso esse cara tá falando, não. E também acho que ele também não liga, não. Acho que meio que ele tá cagando mesmo, assim. Bom... Acho que tá tudo bem. Acho que todo mundo tá sabendo dos seus papéis aqui, né? O Humberto fala merda. Eu sei que ele não liga de falar merda. E a gente segue a vida, dá pra ir.
Aí que nós recebemos um superchat. Lembrando, pessoal, se vocês quiserem aumentar o tempo de live, é só vocês doarem o nosso Live Pix, que o tempo aumenta no cronômetro, beleza? O Vitor Guidorize doou R$5 e falou o seguinte: vocês já notaram que essa mania bizarra do Humberto de piscar toda hora quando tá mentindo? Algum metaforando no chat?
Não preste atenção não, nessa habilidade, nessa dor que ele tem física de mentir, não.
Dor física.
não é bem assim, ou se é bem assim, né, é pro bem, porque afinal de contas os Estados Unidos é bom, o que queriam lá era socialismo, o socialismo é ruim, então os Estados Unidos está certo em evitar o socialismo na Coreia. Esse é o Thiago Braga, que é um propagandista, né, não um profissional da história, até que eu não vi nenhum profissional de história em nenhum lugar, tá, subscrevendo o vídeo do Thiago Braga. Então,
Pois é.
sem mais enrolação.
O que não significa nada, né, Humberto? Porque o que o Thiago Braga estava apresentando, ele tá trazendo o argumento de outros historiadores, e é subsidiado e repetido por outros historiadores em outros lugares. Então, meio que como você tá repetindo argumentos de outras pessoas que já é bem requisitado e bem demonstrado e bem aceito pela academia lá fora, como o Thiago Braga apresentou lá as fontes, meio que não depende, né, dos historiadores brasileiros fazerem um vídeo ou apoiarem. Não entendi muito bem, não. O YouTube é o que dita a regra da estrutura de tese de análise histórica. Então, se eu criar aqui uma tese de análise, se tiver uma tese que está correta dentro da academia, ela necessariamente está sendo reproduzida por você ou por outros agentes no YouTube. Alguém vai estar representando, é isso? Eu não sei, às vezes eu fico realmente perdido, cara. Eu fico tentando entender como é que as pessoas conseguem levar o Humberto Matos a sério. Como é que uma pessoa consegue sentar numa cadeira ou deitar na cama, pegar seu celular ou pegar seu PC, ouvir o Humberto Matos por esse tempo e não perceber essas incoerências básicas assim de um discurso, esses déficits do discurso dele? Absolutamente ninguém no YouTube precisa, qualquer outro historiador precisa levantar a mão e falar que o Thiago Braga tá válido, porque ele não estava levantando uma tese dele, estava trazendo tese de outros, que já são bem consolidadas, e foi apresentado inclusive a contra-argumentação às fontes do Castanhari, que ali sim mostrou problemas nas fontes do Castanhari. Mas não tem argumentação, cara, isso é uma coisa... Sei lá, velho, eu não sei por que eu tô reagindo a esse cara, dá play.
Vou tentar não xingar, embora seja isso que o Henri Bugalho mereça, tá? Porque ele é um anticomunista, ele serve o capim que a extrema-direita come pra engordar. Esse é o trabalho do Henri Bugalho nas redes.
Pausa aí. Quebrou a quarta camada aí, quarta parede aí. Sim, eu uso o Henri Bugalho pra encher o meu bucho. Como descobriu? Dá play, você.
Aí eu acho que o Maurício entrou, hein? Alô, Maurício? Tá ouvindo?
Tá me ouvindo?
Estamos ouvindo, ó, pessoal. Maurício voltou pra live e voltou finalmente.
Salve, pesada. Só uma pergunta, esse ruído horrível, ele tá saindo na live?
Não, tá, é só no seu fone mesmo. Porque essa
Não é
placa de
mesmo,
som
não.
aí, ele repete o bagulho por algum motivo.
Uhum.
Mas tá de boa, não tá sendo aqui não.
Ah, tá. Beleza. Let's
Se
go.
tivesse abrindo aqui, eu quebrava tudo aqui.
Ó, nós recebemos mais um superchat. Nosso amigo Rafael Vieira, ele falou o seguinte: será que Humberto já aprendeu a amarrar o cadastro do tênis? Não sabemos.
Engordar a extrema direita. Como
Toma.
ele tá aqui fazendo, engordando o Thiago Braga. Vamos ouvir o falastrão.
Algumas semanas atrás, o canal Nostalgia do Felipe Castanhari publicou um vídeo contando a história da Guerra da Coreia e como aconteceu a divisão entre Coreia do Norte e Coreia do Sul. E esse vídeo, nesse momento aqui, já tem quase 1 milhão de visualizações e ele foi celebrado por muitos webcomunistas como se fosse o melhor vídeo em língua portuguesa contando a história das Coreias.
Sim, porque é o único material, isso que a galera tem que entender é o seguinte. O que a gente tem aqui, esse canto do planeta, tá, é um orientalismo fudido.
Perdi.
A nossa
Eduardo
intelectualidade é pautada.
Pausa aí. Explica aí o Said, Maurício, vai.
Não, vou esperar o homem chegar, a lenda.
Mas eu não sei se tu percebeu, ele não tá aqui. E o vídeo vai dar play. E aí vai passar.
Pera aí que eu vou chamar esse viado, ele tá enrolando na sala. Pera aí, eu vou chamar ele agora.
Meu Deus do céu.
E dropou o microfone e saiu do estúdio, cara. Enquanto isso, nós leremos o chat aqui. Jogando Dotinha, provavelmente, amigo. Bugalho, esquerda social-democrata tipo PSB, ele não é socialista raiz. Provavelmente não. Maurício Vida Louca. Dá like, pessoal. Narrador deixou o Malboro na mão. Posso tu viu o react do rime verso ao corte do Malboro falando de Marx da matemática? Sim, o Malboro achou uma merda, não quer reagir não. Isso é castigo, Malboro? Perdeu uma aposta? Sim. Uma dança só sabe jogar. É. Assunto flopou, volta a falar do PT.
Arruma aí a câmera, você.
Tu tá... A dança, o que é isso?
Arruma aí a câmera. Bota a câmera mais pra cima.
Por que?
Cara, só faz.
Tu tá fazendo...
Não pergunta não.
Se essa água aqui de cair no microfone não vai dar muito certo não, senhor.
Tu tá fazendo café, a dança. A dança...
Anasca.
A dança tá fazendo café na live, caralho. Vai tomar no cu, cara. A dança que tu tá fazendo, caralho. Tá fazendo café na live.
Sim.
Deixa eu ver, dar uma olhada no chat do Alta Linguagem.
Se fosse eu demitir, perdi. Enfim, deixa eu dar play aqui no vídeo. Vai.
Tá falando do
Pela visão
orientalismo.
ocidental.
Pausa aí, Valsa. Tá falando do orientalismo, Sadus. Falando que a visão do mundo
Isso aí.
aqui da América do Sul é ocidentalizada.
É muito orientalista, ele falou, não falou?
Falou.
Olha, continua aí que eu quero ver mais sobre isso.
Luiz só vai falar isso, vai passar, vamos passar mesmo.
Ah, ele vai passar? Ele só falou isso. que
É, volta 10 segundos aí,
Volta aí, bota.
ocidentada, esse canto do planeta, tá, é um orientalismo fudido. A nossa intelectualidade é pautada, tá, pela visão ocidental de mundo. Uma visão eurocêntrica, uma visão do norte global, uma visão daquilo que é entendido como ocidental.
Então, eu não entendi que ele falou orientalismo, mas pareceu que ele tá falando que a
Cara,
visão-
ele só não sabe o que é isso, cara.
É,
Ele
ele
acha
só não sabe o que é isso mesmo. Porque ele tá confundindo orientalismo com visão
que...
ocidental.
Mas é óbvio, ele não sabe do que ele tá falando.
Não sabe. Orientalismo. É porque a Europa tá